Just a few weeks ago, protesters filled this park and these streets. They invaded the president's house and they chased him from the island. This was just the latest twist in a long story. The story of two ancient peoples, of spices and gems and elephants, of brutal civil war, of corruption and of hope. Over the next 6 videos, we're going to tell the story of Sri Lanka. During these videos, I'm going to be telling 2 stories. The history of the island and how that led to where it is now, and the story of my own travels in Sri Lanka in July and August of 2022. As you'll come to see, those were important months for Sri Lanka, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. Before we begin our journey, let's set the scene and talk geography. Sri Lanka is shaped like a teardrop, with lowlands around the perimeter, which rise to over 2,400 meters in the center. Nowhere in Sri Lanka is more than 70 kilometers from the sea. It has 2 monsoons, one in the southwest and one in the northeast. The low country wet zone is in the southwest of Sri Lanka and doesn't have strong seasons, getting rain from both monsoons. Here, humidity rarely goes below 97% and temperatures hover between 27 and 31 degrees year-round. This is the most densely populated area with coconut and rubber plantations and rice paddy. The mountainous interior is called the hill zone and is generally wet, with most places getting rain year-round. Despite Sri Lanka being in the tropics, it can actually get pretty cold up here. The largest zone, which is about 3/4 of the country's land area, is the low country dry zone of the northern, southern and eastern plains. These areas are dry and hot, such as the Yala and Bundala national parks. All of this is cut through by around 103 river systems that run down from the highlands and are used for irrigation. Sri Lanka has crocodiles, elephants and leopards, and a bird called the ashy-headed laughing thrush. Now Sri Lanka is a crowded place. It's smaller than Scotland, but with around 4 times the population. So, who lives there? It's here we have to take a detour into ethnicity. Now, a lot of this discussion of ethnicity and origins on the island of Sri Lanka is controversial and contested. I'm wading through this as a non-local, but I hope as a neutral non-local. If I get anything wrong or I'm tone deaf on some aspect, I apologize. But the information that I'll present in this video is as close as I can get to what is true. Now, let's begin. Sri Lanka today is around 3/4 Sinhalese, 15% Tamil, almost 10% Sri Lankan Muslims, plus some other things. A large part of the modern story of Sri Lanka is about ethnic conflict. However, the relationship between these different groups is extremely complicated, and much of the conflict is actually relatively recent. There's the added factors of religion and language, which sometimes function like ethnicity and complicate it further. A lot of the debate is about who came first and who controlled what parts of the island. I'm presenting what I know from what I've read, but at least some of this is contested. Let's start with the Veddas. These are the indigenous and probably original inhabitants of the island, but their numbers have shrunken so low and so little is known about their prehistory that unfortunately they won't play a major part in the modern story of Sri Lanka. They may have been on the island for a long time. I've seen a few numbers, but somewhere between 15,000 and 18,000 years seems to be the most common estimates. Either way, now there are only around 2,000 of them left, or maybe 500. I've seen both numbers, but there aren't many. The Veddas have their own languages which are completely separate from the other ones on the island. They've become more and more assimilated, and their languages are apparently close to extinction. They were traditionally hunter-gatherers, but with the best land now farmed, the rest is mostly national park, so they can't do much hunting and gathering anymore. Now they seem to scrape by on tourism. This website, the top hit on Google, gives a flavor. Access to the private home of the chief of the tribe and an opportunity to have a dialogue. The possibility to experience their way of life, including the use of the bow and arrow. Unique photo opportunities that will be the envy of your friends. Now come the Sinhalese, the majority group on the island. There are around 16 million of them, and roughly 3/4 of the people of Sri Lanka are Sinhalese. The Sinhalese are mostly Buddhist and trace their history back to northern India as part of the Indo-Aryan people. It's not absolutely certain when the Sinhalese arrived in the island, but according to sources written in Pali, the language of the Buddha, the descendants of the Sinhalese came in 543 BCE, led by Prince Vijaya. These Indo-Aryans then mixed with the indigenous to form the Sinhalese. The next group are the Tamils. The Tamils are Dravidian, which is to say from southern India. Southern and northern India are linguistically two completely different universes, and Tamil and Sinhalese are unintelligible to each other, as well as using different alphabets. In fact, the languages of northern India have much more in common with other Indo-European languages like Russian, French, and Greek than they do with Tamil. That's how different we're talking. Tamils are a majority in the northern province, and there are large numbers in the east, but they are a minority in the rest of Sri Lanka, being around 15% of the total population. They are mostly Hindus, though there are also significant numbers of Christian Tamils, around about a quarter. But the Tamils aren't only in Sri Lanka. For one thing, the state of Tamil Nadu is the 6th biggest state of India. The Tamils are one of the world's great peoples, and have had a profound influence on the history of Asia. For a start, there are more than 75 million Tamils, which is more than the Spanish, Portuguese, and Swedish people combined, and roughly as many as there are Germans. The Tamil homeland is in South India, where 1 in 20 Indians is a Tamil. As well as the almost 70 million in India, they are 15% of Sri Lanka's population, 7% of Malaysia's, 5% of Singapore's, as well as 10% of Mauritius's. Ancient Tamil kingdoms traded with the Romans, and Tamils brought Hinduism and Buddhism across the ocean to Southeast Asia. The Khmer script in Cambodia, as well as Java and Thai, all descend from an alphabet introduced by Tamil traders. The Tamil language itself is one of the world's longest surviving classical languages, going back at least 2,500 years. English historian Michael Wood has called the Tamils the last surviving classical civilization on Earth because of how much of their beliefs, music, literature, and culture they have preserved uncontaminated for thousands of years. Now, the important question: when did they come to Sri Lanka? This is important because who was there first forms a big part of the claims to what rights each group should have now. Of course, the question should be totally irrelevant because we know who was there first: the Veddas. But they are never mentioned because they have been so totally screwed by everyone else that they have been made irrelevant to this conversation. Like I said before, this is highly contested and there isn't really a clear consensus. Settlements of people that appear culturally similar to present-day Tamils have been excavated and dated to around the same time that the Sinhalese probably arrived. What is definite is that the Indian Tamil kingdoms were involved in the island's affairs from around 200 BCE, which is very soon after the Sinhalese probably got there. So if the Sinhalese got to the island first, it wasn't by much. However, during this early period, there were almost certainly never large numbers of Tamils in Sri Lanka, and where they were was geographically limited. It was only in the 13th century that we know that Tamils were present on the island in large numbers, when they established the Jaffna kingdom in the north of the island. And from then on, the north has largely been Tamil. But in truth, until that point, since the Sinhalese arrived, the history of the island was mostly one of the Sinhalese. However, to add another wrinkle, the Sinhalese kings would very regularly bring over Tamil mercenaries to fight for them from India, so demographically they weren't so important, but politically you could argue that they were. So while Tamils may have been on the island almost as long as the Sinhalese, they haven't been present in large numbers until the last 1,000 years, and have always been a minority. There's a significant subgroup here as well. The Indian Tamils, also called the plantation Tamils, were mostly descended from workers that came to work on the coffee, tea, and rubber plantations during the colonial era. They are geographically separated from the Sri Lankan Tamils of the north because they mostly live in the central highlands or hill country, where a lot of the tea is grown. Today there are about 1 million of them, around 4% of Sri Lanka's total population. They are Tamils, true, but in terms of the island's politics, they are sufficiently separate to basically be considered a different group. Some came from other parts of South India than the original Sri Lankan Tamils of the north. Unlike the Sri Lankan Tamils, they are almost universally Hindu without large numbers of Christians. Arguably, the plantation Tamils have endured more discrimination and hardship than any other group in modern Sri Lanka. They are one of the poorest and most neglected groups in the country and were stripped of their status at independence. Around 300,000 were still stateless as late as 2003. And here's where it is really messed messed up. A lot of the discrimination against these plantation Tamils was done with the participation of the Sri Lankan Tamils, who don't feel much in common with them. Do you want more divisions? Well, running through both of these communities, the Sinhalese and the Tamils, is the caste system. This video is too short to go into a real explanation of what caste is, but you can think of it as a system in which an individual's role and function in society is determined by the caste they were born into. You are who you are because of who your ancestors have been. A person must marry within that group, and the identity of that group defines the life he or she will lead. If your ancestors peeled cinnamon, so do you. In the 65 years since independence, all but one of Sri Lanka's leaders have been from the landowner caste, the Gayagama. In the words of John Gimlette, who you were, or rather who your people had been many centuries before, affected every aspect of your relationships with others. Most caste systems have a hierarchy with upper caste people literally above lower caste people, and the theme of purity and pollution is at the center of it. So this is broadly true about how caste works, but I talked to a lot of people about this in Sri Lanka, and it seems for young people now, at least in urban areas, caste doesn't matter that much. It might matter for weddings, who you marry, but young educated urban people might not even know their caste. However, this wouldn't necessarily be true in more conservative rural areas. Also, broadly speaking, caste among the Sinhalese is generally a lot less extensive and relatively less important than amongst the Tamil. For one thing, there is no concept of untouchability amongst the Sinhalese. Untouchability is one of the most grotesque ideas ever thought of by human beings. Look it up. It is exactly what it sounds like. Amongst the Tamils, caste is far more rigid and is anchored to Hindu ritual, which makes it a lot more inflexible. For instance, some castes aren't allowed inside temples. In 1930, the British tried to enforce equal seating in schools in the Jaffna Peninsula so that the lower caste Tamils could get educated. Higher caste Tamils rioted and burned schools. It's serious business. Compare that to Buddhism, and there isn't really a religious sanction by Buddhism for the caste system, so you could say it's just not so deeply rooted. Before we end this part on ethnicity, we should zoom in on Tamil-Sinhalese relations, because this is the single most important issue in the modern history of the island. The Sinhalese are by far the majority on the island, but they are looking across the water at the 70 million Tamils in southern India, vastly outnumbering them. One Sri Lankan historian characterized the Sinhalese as a majority community with a minority complex. Conversely, the Tamils are a minority with a majority complex because while they are a minority on the island, they feel a part of this huge regional civilization, which they are. However, on the island of Sri Lanka, these two communities have always been intertwined. I already mentioned how Tamil soldiers were brought over from southern India to fight for Sinhalese kings, or take religion. The simplification is that the Sinhalese are Buddhist and the Tamils are Hindu. That ignores important religious minorities, but it's not too far off. However, in Buddhist temples in Sri Lanka, you'll often see statues of both the Buddha and Hindu gods, and some gods like Kataragama are actually shared by both. You also look at the way they dress, and the saris are similar, if not identical. And then there is genetics, which is either the most important or least important piece of evidence. The fact is that while the Sinhalese language arrived from northern India and the Tamils arrived from South India, genetic studies have shown that the two groups are actually highly mixed. There has been a ton of intermarriage over the last 1,000 years or so. The punchline is that Tamils and Sinhalese are culturally distinct, but have lived together without clear borders for centuries. The last group that needs to be introduced are the Moors or Muslims. They are often referred to in books and by people without a proper explanation, because I've always thought of Islam as a religion, not an ethnic group. So I asked a lot of people about this while I was there, and what I came to understand is that Muslims within Sri Lanka essentially function as an ethnicity. Many people, including Sri Lankan Muslims themselves, say they descended from Arab traders who came to the island many centuries ago, but genetic testing shows that the majority come from Indian Muslims who moved here. However, because most of these immigrants were male, they had to marry locals, and the genetics of Sri Lankan Muslims are the most diverse of any group on the island. There are other subgroups within the category of Sri Lankan Muslim as well, like the Malays, and Sri Lankan Muslims are also divided by what type of Islam they follow. For example, there are the Bora, who are insular and highly endogamous, who are Shia Muslims who originally came from Yemen in the 1300s and arrived in Sri Lanka via Gujarat in India in the 1800s and speak Gujarati. They basically function as a caste and are highly involved in commerce. It really is a patchwork. Mostly Sri Lankan Muslims speak Tamil as a first language, though that does depend on location, and many also speak Indian languages like Gujarati or Hindi with their families. Importantly, the Sri Lankan Muslim Tamil speakers don't identify as Tamils. So Muslim is treated as a label, but this is mainly imposed from the outside. Sri Lankan Muslims don't necessarily see themselves as one monolithic group, and the internal groups are more relevant. The groups that make up Sri Lankan Muslims don't tend to intermarry. However, by non-Muslims in Sri Lanka, they tend to be grouped together. There are other groups in Sri Lanka too, like the Burghers, who are of mixed European ancestry, but it's complicated enough as it is, so we'll leave it there. Let's revise. The two largest groups in Sri Lanka are the Sinhalese and the Tamils. The Sinhalese are mostly Buddhist and come originally from northern India. The Tamils are mostly Hindu and come from southern India. Though the Tamils have in some sense been on the island for almost as long as the Sinhalese, they have only been present in large numbers in the past 1,000 years, or half as long as the Sinhalese. Because of having lived together for so long, genetically they are pretty mixed up, but they are culturally distinct. Though modern narratives of ethnic nationalism have simplified this a lot, the two communities have long been intertwined on the island, and divisions within these groups, such as caste divisions, have been just as relevant as between them. Okay, so now you have a broad sense of the major groups in the story. Now let's take a look at what Sri Lanka looks like and feels like today. And I arrived in Colombo at the start of July 2022. The details of what was going on in Sri Lanka in 2022 are going to be in the 6th video in the series, but all you need to know is that in the weeks and months before I arrived, Sri Lanka had been going through an intense economic crisis, was short of foreign exchange, was having trouble importing fuel and even medicine, and had been rocked by riots that involved the government bussing in thugs to beat up the protesters. And most of that was centered around Galle and Fort, which is where I was staying. Because of the unrest, many of the streets of the central city were blocked off. There were still some protests, but, and I didn't realize this at the time, because it was a weekday, they weren't very big. I thought I had missed the action, but it would get pretty real the very next weekend. But you will see that in due course. I did come across this, a graveyard of vehicles destroyed in the riots. Now, I can't be certain, but what do these holes look like to you? What there were long lines of tuk-tuks waiting for fuel. Everywhere I came across them. I was told one stretched for 1.5 kilometers, another one for 3. Drivers could only take out 5 liters maximum if any fuel was available at all. In many cases, people waited for days and had to sleep in their vehicles. For most of these people, their tuk-tuk is their only income. They were all unanimous about one thing, and they weren't shy about telling me. They wanted the president, known as Gota, to go. Occasionally the line would move and the drivers would get out to push for a few meters. And this is what they were waiting for. The gas station, heavily policed to keep everyone in line. Anyway, I had lunch. This is kotu roti, which is a Sri Lankan staple, basically chopped roti bread with a curry sauce over the top. It's pretty good. Fort District itself, even though it's in the middle of the city, feels a lot like a village. Then there's the tree life throughout the city, where people are forced to make way for the wood. I don't know any other city with foliage as good as Colombo. On my first evening in Sri Lanka, I went down to Weiss, the park along the seafront that serves as the unofficial meeting spot of central Colombo. Every bus I would take in Sri Lanka was absolutely packed full of people. Because of the fuel crisis, fewer people could drive, and on top of that, fewer buses would run. The perfect recipe for overcrowding. As well as the trees, Sri Lanka is a country of crows, which are absolutely everywhere. In the next video in this series, we will explore more of Colombo, as well as look at Anuradhapura, the great hydraulic civilization of Sri Lanka.